I've just muted everyone because there was a fair bit of background noise and an echo and a whine. As you know, I will pause and make time for questions and comments. I also would like to remind you, as always, feel free to hit the space bar, and then you will be able to comment whenever you want. And as you know, I welcome your comments. I'm happy to be in dialogue with you. So please don't hesitate to just make a comment, ask a question whenever one occurs. You don't have to wait for me to do that. So I am going to jump right into my lecture. And I've got a lecture on the election, surprise, surprise, today. I do think at this point in the election cycle, we're actually in a position to look pretty synthetically and systematically at what's happening in the 2020 campaign. But I think even more important than that, I'm going to refer to the last couple weeks and really the week before last as the week that the myth of Donald Trump collapsed. And so I want to develop that theme with you today. And I want to talk about its implications, not only for the presidential election of 2020, but also for American politics going forward. And to remember that what we witnessed in the Republican Party convention, what we've really witnessed over the last 4 years is that the Republican Party has become the party of Donald Trump. It is tightly identified not only with his policies and his style of politics, but with him as an individual. And so if Donald Trump has seen a significant decline, not only in his popularity, but also in his credibility over the last 2 weeks. And this is not a entirely new or recent phenomenon. It's been going on, but I think really the last 2 weeks, if you will, have punctured the balloon of Donald Trump. His capacity to sustain his image and his brand, which has been really what his business model and then his political career have been about for the last 20 years at least, it seems to me is vastly diminished in light of what's happened over the last couple of weeks. And so if the Republican Party is tightly identified as the party of Donald Trump, what does it do not only to Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election, but what does it do to the partisan dynamic of American electoral politics, let's say over the next 3 or 4 election cycles going to the middle of the coming decade? And then I do want to note that one of the things that people have talked about in the presidency of Donald Trump, and apologies for the jargon, is the remasculinization of the presidency, that Donald Trump has really brought a manly macho style to the presidency that's been extremely important to the image he projects and the way in which he governs. And it does seem to me that it's going to be difficult to uncouple some of the damage that Donald Trump has done to himself from his masculinist style. So I will conclude with some reflections on that as well. Let me start by bringing you up to date on what's happening in the election. And I'll start with my usual proviso or qualification. This is based on polling and other data. It's not a fail-safe prediction. But it is worthwhile noting that at this point, voting is underway in many states, and that in fact, millions of Americans have already voted. And so that what we're seeing in the polls and the other ways in which we build models to predict the outcome of elections right now has perhaps greater predictive capacity. And that's not only because the voting is actually underway. And so what we're seeing right now is, in a sense, somewhat like an eve of the election poll, as opposed to a poll that's 25 days before the election, which is where we are right now. But in addition to that, aspects of the kind of support that Joe Biden is getting seems to indicate that it's very stable, that something dramatic would have to change in order for Joe Biden's current lead to evaporate on him. And we see this in two ways. One of them is the metric that's sometimes referred to as strength of support. Do you support your candidate, or do you strongly support your candidate? Do you disapprove of Donald Trump, or do you strongly disapprove of Donald Trump? And what we see is that most of the support that Joe Biden is getting, much of the disapproval that Donald Trump is getting, is in the strong category. It's not just that we kind of support Joe Biden, it's that people really feel strongly about supporting Joe Biden. And that tends to be less volatile and more durable in an election than weak support or average support. Similarly, when we look at vote share, and this is getting a little technical here for a moment, but it's one thing to have a polling lead of around 10 points, which in the average of the polls in the United States is Joe Biden's lead right now. Let's say if that polling lead is 45 to 35, right? And if you do the math real quickly, that means that 10% of the people are undecided, and that therefore, if they break in the direction of Trump, it's possible that Trump would make up that lead. That was the scenario, by the way, in 2016, which is we had a large share of undecided voters. And so though Clinton had a lead in the polls, there was room for Donald Trump to make up ground. What we're seeing right now in the polls is that Joe Biden's vote share is 52%. That is to say that in these polls, 52% of people say they're going to support him. And so it's 52 to 42. That means there's only about 5-6% of the population who's undecided. And that makes it much harder for Donald Trump to make up the ground. Even if all the undecided voters break in his direction, Joe Biden still has a majority of the popular vote, right? And we'll get into the states in a moment. That's another reason to believe that the lead that we're seeing from Joe Biden with 25 days to go in the election cycle is a solid lead, is an apparently stable lead. Now, as we know, the action is really at the state level. And this diagram is identical to what it looked like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, North Carolina and Ohio were in Trump's column, not in Biden's column. So there has been some movement at the state level recently. But now it appears that this is quite stable. The question would be, will Biden make inroads in Georgia or Texas? There's some signs in the polling that he's in striking distance in some of those Sunbelt states that have been solidly Republican since Ronald Reagan's election. But having said that this is stable for the time being, let me point out to you that when we drill down at the state level, there actually is movement, and it is movement in Biden's direction as well, which is to say, in a sense, this election probably hinges on what happens in Pennsylvania, which is to say, it's difficult to envision Donald Trump winning this election. If he doesn't win Pennsylvania, it's difficult to envision Joe Biden losing this election if he wins Pennsylvania, right? And what's happened over the last couple of weeks is that Biden has opened a sizable lead in Pennsylvania as well. And so again, this is not a poll per se, this is a model based on aggregating a bunch of polls and looking at some other economic data and data to do with the virus. And what we see is that Pennsylvania is now solidly in Biden's column. This had not been the case in the past, and there'd been some differences between Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, with Wisconsin and Michigan more solidly for Biden and Pennsylvania less so. And the fact that Pennsylvania is now aligned with Michigan and Wisconsin, which had some people puzzled, right? They seem to be similar states demographically and politically, indicates that in the Midwest, in the states where essentially Clinton lost the election in 2016, or Trump won the election in 2016, Biden seems to now be in a very solid position. So I want to drill down on the state data a little bit, and I'm going to do it in two different ways. And so one of them is just to look at the averages and how they've changed from September 23rd to October 7th. And so that's what I'm going to argue today is this critical period in which the myth of Donald Trump collapsed. And what you can see is whether we look at Florida or New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, even Georgia and Iowa, those are more Republican leading states, Ohio, etc. In all of these states, with the exception of Texas, Biden has increased his lead over the last couple of weeks, and on average by about 2 percentage points. And at this point in the race, that's a really significant movement in the direction of the person who's already in the lead. Similarly, and this is drawing not on what I've been drawing on up until this point, which is the 538 polling aggregation model, but instead looking at the New York Times upshot model, what it shows is in the US and then state by state, how Biden is doing. They are a little bit more favorable to Biden in states like Georgia or Florida, for instance. But it also shows, look, in 2016, the polls were off, and they were off in favor of Clinton against Trump, right? So if the polls are off in 2016 by as much as they were if they're off as much in 2020 as by as much as they were in 2016, what are the implications for the race? And as you can see, even if we have sizable polling error in favor of Joe Biden, he is still going to win enough states to win the election, assuming that the current polling more or less holds. But it's worthwhile noting that polling error occurs in both directions. And in 2012, the polls were biased against the Democratic candidate, Barack Obama, not in their favor. And some of the corrections that pollsters have made in 2020 to correct for the mistakes in 2016 may mean that the bias now is actually in favor of Trump. I'm not saying that. We won't know that one way or another until after the election is conducted. But I need to just have you bear in mind the possibility that the polls are actually at this point mistaken in the direction of Trump, not in the direction of Biden. And so Biden could be doing even better than these polls indicate. Now, looking at two different diagrams on how the polls have changed to get a sense of the current political dynamic. One of these diagrams is from 538, the main source I've been using up until this point, and it goes from June until the present. And in particular, the area of the graph I want you to focus on is from September 1st to the present. And what you can see is in the immediate aftermath of the Republican nominating convention, Biden's lead got as small as it's gotten really this summer or fall, right? It was down to him having about a 2/3 chance, but Trump having about a 1/3 chance of winning the election on this model. But that since the nominating convention, things have moved fairly uniformly in Biden's direction, fairly rapidly in the immediate aftermath of the conventions, and then again, quite stably and rapidly in Biden's direction over the last couple of weeks. Now, if we look at this in the longer durée, right, this is from Real Clear Politics polling average, what we can see is going all the way back to October of 2019, looking at the polling average, right, Biden is up by 12, 13% over Trump. This, by the way, is when Rudy Giuliani is in the Ukraine on an expedition on behalf of the president to try to dig up dirt on Biden, right? Because he's looking at these numbers. And what I want you to see to kind of telescope, right, look at the beginning and the end, is that as we enter the home stretch of the election, Biden's lead is almost as large as it was in October when Trump sent Giuliani to the Ukraine, right? And so this is what Trump was worried about, why that excursion occurred. And this is more or less where we are today. Now, if we were to translate this into electoral college votes, this is using the New York Times upshot model. What we could see is if in all states where Biden is ahead by 3 or more points, he were to win, right? So his lead is bigger than the margin of error in the polls, he would win a decisive electoral college victory. If in all states in which he's ahead, just ahead, right? Not by 3 points or more. Today, he wins a landslide electoral college victory. And if we correct the polls to say that they're as mistaken as they were in 2016, and so give Trump a fair bit more support in many states, you would still have a fairly solid Biden electoral college victory. Remember, you need basically 270 votes to win in the electoral college. He gets 319, even if the polling is skewed in Biden's favor as much as it was in Clinton's favor in 2016. Now, because this is not just a presidential race, this is a national election in which the Senate and the House of Representatives are up for grabs. I wanted to spend a minute looking at those races as well. And so I'm drilling down on the Senate races that are most close at this point. And what you can see is there's a slight chance that the Democrats will flip Iowa, with Jody Ernst losing, but that's a very close, very tight race. There's a better chance that they will flip Maine, where Susan Collins has been put in a really difficult position by her support of Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominees, and a pretty good chance that the Democrats will win in North Carolina, though there's been some disturbing news coming out on the Democratic candidate there, who apparently has been engaged in at least some text message-based flirtation in a way that may damage his reputation. Then if we look at Arizona, there's a very strong chance that the Democrats will flip Arizona, and essentially an equally strong chance that the Republicans will flip Alabama in the Senate race. All this means that there's a pretty good chance, roughly a 2/3 chance, that the Democrats will have control of the Senate, especially if Biden wins, because that gives them the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And so when we add that to the fact that the Democrats are currently in control of the House, and that basically when we do the models, it looks like they're likely to extend their advantage in the House, so that there's a roughly 94% chance that the Democrats will retain control of the House, we see overall around a 65% chance, around a 2/3 chance, that the Democrats will control the presidency, the Senate, and the House starting in January of next year. Now, I wanted to give you that more extensive overview of what's happening in American electoral politics right now, because I want to now focus on what happened to Donald Trump in the last couple of weeks, and to point out to you that because the Republican Party is so strongly associated with Donald Trump, because so many members of the Senate and the House have tied their political fortunes to him, as Donald Trump's star begins to fade, so too do the electoral chances of the Republicans. Now, let's look at what's happened to Donald Trump in the week that just concluded. And I want to tell this story as a story in 4 acts. And I'm going to start with the first 2 acts. And so I'm going back 2 Saturdays ago. And this is, of course, the night that Donald Trump announced that Judge Amy Coney Barrett was his nominee to replace the seat held by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsberg on the Supreme Court, right? And that nomination party brought members of the Senate, other important VIPs from the Republican Party, a significant portion of Donald Trump's staff to the White House, to the Rose Garden, to a reception inside the White House. And what we now know is that this was the event that became the center of a coronavirus outbreak. In fact, the worst coronavirus outbreak in Washington, D.C. right now. I don't know exactly what makes an event a super spreader event, but it appears that this is an event in which a large number of people came into contact with other people who had the virus and then contracted the virus. It's far from clear whether Donald Trump himself contracted the virus at this event, or perhaps already had the virus at this point. But what is clear is that appropriate precautions were not taken. And we can look at the photographic evidence on this. It's very clear. Social distancing was not there in the Rose Garden event. The chairs were 6 inches apart from each other, not 6 feet apart from each other. Nobody was wearing a mask. And we now know a little bit more about what went wrong. And so I'll just spend a minute on this. The way in which they approached protection from the coronavirus in the White House in general, and at this event in particular, the announcement of Judge Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court, was through testing. They used exclusively testing. And not only that, they used an instant testing system that really is designed only for people who are already symptomatic. It's not approved for use on people who are asymptomatic. This is sometimes called in medicine an off-label use of a product. You're using a product for something that it hasn't been approved for. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Botox, which is approved for muscle spasms in the eye, but of course is used now to smooth out people's face. That's an off-label use. That's not what it was approved for, right? The system of testing that was used at the White House was not approved for the kind of use it was being put to. That is to make sure that people who are not symptomatic are nevertheless not transmitting the virus. And anyone who's a public health expert in this will tell you that relying on testing alone is a foolish strategy. That when you have a deadly airborne virus, you need to have redundant strategies, especially an airborne virus for which there's no effective vaccine and very limited effective therapeutic treatments. And that's why there's the emphasis on wearing masks, on social distancing, on hand washing, on avoiding indoor gatherings and high concentrations of people in the same place at the same time. And the fact that the White House is not acting on the science, on the medical advice, on the best practices as we understand them from public health research in the United States and the world today, is why the President of the United States has coronavirus. And it's why this event turned into a super spreader event. And we can now ask, why did that happen, right? Why didn't the White House act on the best medical and scientific evidence? And I think there's two things to be said. I think the first is simply that the President of the United States has very little respect for science, medicine, public health. Let's call it the received wisdom of the day. He trusts his gut and instincts, his own intelligence, over that of experts. And he's made an entire career out of bucking the wisdom. We'll look at that career in some detail in just a moment, but by doing things his own way, relying on his own instincts and hunches, his wile and smarts, his charisma, to bend whatever people tell him to his advantage, to his will. And he's relied on his capacity to do this throughout the virus. And so in a sense, this is about a decision-making and approach, and it's being revealed to be a disastrous decision-making approach. But there's a second reason that masks were not worn at this event, and that is because the whole purpose of this event was to change the narrative of the election. And to be clear about this, the American people, the evidence is very clear. Between 60% and 2/3 of us disapprove of the way in which the president has handled the pandemic. And so if the focus of the election is on the pandemic and the president's handling of it, the president isn't doing well. He's in trouble. The death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave the president an opening in this election, a chance to turn the narrative to something else, to a Supreme Court nomination, to get national attention focused away from the virus and on another contested judicial appointment. This was likely not only to rally his base, who cares perhaps more about judicial appointments than practically any other issue, but also to change the overall focus of national political attention away from the virus and Trump's handling of it. And so in order to do that, in order to use the event at the White House 2 Saturdays ago to do that, Trump needed masks not to be present. He needed no reminder of the virus at this event. And so the effort to change the narrative, in the end, completely backfired, to the extent that not only Donald Trump contracted the virus, perhaps at this event, but because so many people in his orbit, his press secretary, his most trusted advisors, his wife, 2 senators at least, all contracted the virus apparently at this event. It has shifted attention squarely back onto the virus. All right, the second thing that happened last Saturday, the second act in the drama that results in the collapse of the myth of Donald Trump, is that the New York Times published Trump's tax returns. I spoke with you a little bit about this a week ago, but I really have more information to share with you this week, and so I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. And what the Trump tax returns reveal, the kind of screaming headline, is that Donald Trump has paid very little taxes for a very long time, right? $750, a made-up number, 2 years in a row in his first 2 years in the presidency. That's the president essentially saying, I'm the head of the federal government. There's no chance in hell that the IRS is going to audit me while I'm in office. And so I'm just going to make up a number, right? The idea that it would be precisely $750 2 years in a row has absolutely zero credibility or likelihood, right? But in addition to that, we also know all of the shenanigans that Trump is employing to keep his taxes down. And we know, by the way, that in a court in New York, there was an order last week that Trump has to turn over his taxes to Cyrus Vance Jr., the prosecutor who was going after him for tax and accounting crimes, right? And the New York Times gave us a close look at some of those tax gimmicks that the president uses to bring his taxes down. For instance, paying his daughter a 6-figure consulting fee, despite the fact that she's already drawing a large salary for working for the Trump organization. So all of that is the kind of top line. But when we get underneath the scandal of the fact that the president of the United States basically is not contributing to the federal coffers, we see a detailed portrait of the profits and losses of the Trump organization going back for 20 years. And what we can see is that the Trump organization was in trouble in the early 2000s, that it got a huge boost, you could call it a lifeline, from The Apprentice and the licensing and endorsement spin-offs of the success of The Apprentice. So brand Trump increased dramatically. But what we can also see is that the money that came out of this tremendous boon that the president got from The Apprentice was quickly reinvested by the president into new businesses and ventures, especially into the ownership of golf course and new real estate. And very quickly, the new businesses began to lose money, and the losses from the new investments quickly came to dwarf the profits from the successful businesses in Trump's portfolio. And of course, as the revenues from The Apprentice and its spinoffs began to decline and the losses from the investments began to grow, Donald Trump found himself in debt. And what we now know is that he's between $300 and $400 million in debt, much of it due over the next few years. And so I think the second act, right, of the drama that destroyed the myth of Donald Trump is the myth of the successful businessman, right? Trump wants us to believe that he successfully handled the virus or to not pay much attention to the virus. What happened on that Saturday night when so many people caught the virus at the White House really makes it difficult to sustain that myth. He wants us to believe that he's an incredibly successful businessman, that he has tremendous business strategic acumen, that he has mastered the art of the deal, that he brings that expertise to bear with him as a politician. That was his main argument for running in 2016, that only he could fix the problems that the United States have because politics as usual fails, whereas somebody who is a successful entrepreneur has the skill set needed to cut through the bureaucratic and politics as usual impediments to turning America around and making it great again. Well, what the New York Times reporting reveals is that Donald Trump inherited roughly $400 million from his father, mostly camouflaged through probably illegal transfers in order to avoid taxes. That he took that $400 million and invested it in real estate, some of it, like Trump Tower in Manhattan, quite successful, but much of it actually failed, especially the casino enterprises in Atlantic City. That he was on his way to really being a failed businessman until The Apprentice came along and bailed him out. That although the business model of The Apprentice really dramatically boosted brand Trump, and he profited tremendously on it, right? $400 million in profits from The Apprentice and the licensing and endorsement agreements that came out of it. He rapidly reinvested that money in other businesses that failed, to the point where his liquidity is deeply challenged in 2020. One of the things I think it's just worth noticing for a moment here is that running for the president, we now know from, for instance, Steve Cohen's memoir, was primarily a business gambit for Donald Trump. He thought it was the best way to rebrand himself, to reattract attention to his brand. And that it turns out that although revenue from The Apprentice and from the licensing and endorsement agreements was already trailing off in the first 5 years of the last decade, it really declined in the aftermath of his announcement for the presidency, because he played the politics of division, of racial division in particular, calling Mexicans rapists and murderers, and pretty soon the Trump brand became toxic for many of the sources that had been giving revenue to the Trumps for licensing and endorsement, television agreements, etc. So Act 3, the debate. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of information about how the debate was received. We had a little bit of this last week. We have more of it this week. What we can see is that Biden clearly won the debate based on the instant poll surveys, that when we compare the people who had liked Trump before with the people who like him after the debate. So these are people who we have data for both before and after the debate. Trump's unfavorability rating went up. His favorability rating went down. Biden's favorability rating went up. His unfavorability rating went down. That whether we look at it in terms of performance or policies, Trump got mainly negative reviews. Biden got mainly positive reviews. When we look at it in terms of who people are likely to vote for or who people think will win the election, what we see is that Biden benefited from his performance in the debate. Now, what I want to do for just a minute is to talk a little bit about why Biden benefited from the debate. And this is, in a sense, obvious, right? Trump not only violated the rules of the debate, he also seriously disregarded the rules of everyday courtesy and decorum. Ethno-linguists actually study this, right? Which is to say, in different cultures, you have different rules about how long a conversational pause you need before you can interject your idea without it being a rude interruption of the other person. And so Italians and Israelis have famously short pauses, right? It almost sounds like they're talking over each other, but it's actually not rudeness in their culture because they have a shorter pause than, say, the British or the Americans or the Germans do. But Donald Trump obviously disregarded this norm that we wait for somebody else to finish talking before we start talking. Right. And so this appears to have been Donald Trump's main strategy for this debate, which is to say, I'm going to throw Joe Biden off his game. I'm going to expose him as weak and old, addled, and confused by making him so disoriented that he gets tongue-tied, that he misremembers his facts, that he can't hold his own, right? And Trump tried this, not just for the first 10 minutes of the debate, but for the entire 90 minutes of the debate. And by and large, it failed. I don't think Biden had a brilliant performance, but Biden didn't crumble. Biden didn't become deeply confused. Frankly, Trump had set the expectations on Joe Biden rather low. And the result is not only that Joe Biden came out of this debate looking like the person who is more decent, more composed. But in addition to that, the vision of Donald Trump as a strategic genius, right? Somebody who could go into a negotiation and get the best deal for himself, who would get us better deals with China, who would de-escalate relationships with Russia and North Korea, given his strategic acumen, his ability to negotiate, I think also collapsed in this debate. We saw this is the best strategy the president of the United States has for turning his campaign around when he's already behind. He tried it once, he tried it twice, he didn't have any fallback position. No wonder the trade war with China is going so poorly. No wonder the Russians still feel that they can interfere in our elections with impunity. No wonder North Korea and Iran are continuing to develop strategic nuclear weapons, despite the fact that the president of the United States repeatedly threatens them. They don't believe he has any kind of long-term strategy. And what we saw in the debate was on display the limited strategic capacity of the President of the United States. I'll say one more thing about the debate, and that is, you may remember this moment in which Biden was trying to call attention to the fact that it's reported that the president said about troops when he was in France to celebrate the anniversary of D-Day, that he wasn't going to go to the graveyard because the people buried there were suckers and fools, right? And Biden was trying to call attention to the fact that his son, Beau Biden, was a war hero before he tragically died. And Trump interrupted him in the middle of Biden talking about his recently deceased son to bring the debate back to Biden's other son, Hunter, right, who has struggled with drug addiction, who Trump has tried to tar with the brush of corruption, and by implication to also tar Joe Biden with corruption. And I think, if I've got it right, that moment, though I don't think Joe Biden handled it very well, was akin to the moment that we all remember from the McCarthy hearings, in which Joseph Welch, the Army attorney, said to Joe McCarthy, "Have you no decency, sir?" Right? It was such a nakedly indecent moment from Donald Trump that, again, I think the idea that his brashness, his vigor, his aggression are in our service collapsed at that moment in the debate. So let me now get to the fourth and final act, and that is the fact that Donald Trump then contracted the coronavirus. And I want to be clear, we don't know when Donald Trump contracted the coronavirus. And the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability here, I think, is in and of itself scandalous. In part because, of course, Donald Trump had that event at the White House, followed by the debate, followed by a rally, followed by a fundraiser in New Jersey. And we deserve to know at what point he knew he had the virus and continued about his activities. Maybe the truth is that he didn't know till late Thursday night, early Friday morning. And so although he may have exposed hundreds of people, he did so without foreknowledge. But we don't know that. So let's say, let's give the president the benefit of the doubt that he contracted the corona, that he got his first positive test result Thursday evening, announced it early Friday morning. That's Act 4, right? That the president has the virus. And as you can see, as I said earlier, most Americans disapprove of the president's handling of the virus. This will almost certainly go up as we learn more about the White House's mismanagement now that there's an outbreak in the White House itself. And the fact that the president of the United States has the virus is calling tremendous attention to the virus at exactly the moment when the president wants to pivot away from it, right? And so this does not favor his re-election chances. And I want to point out to you that there is a partisan split on this opinion, with a little bit over 80% of Republicans approving of the way in which the president has handled the outbreak, the pandemic. But I will point out to you that that means that almost 20% of Republicans disapprove. And those 20% who disapprove, those are primarily elderly people. Those are primarily suburban housewives. Those are the people that Donald Trump was trying to win back in order to be able to have a fighting chance in this election. And they are the people who are most likely going to consolidate their support for Joe Biden now that they see that the president has mismanaged this so badly that he has exposed himself to it and much of his staff to it and much of his party's senior leadership to it. By the way, when we look at independents, another group that the president really needs support from to have a chance in this election, it's 2/3 to 1/3 disapproving of the way in which the president has handled the virus. And so now let me say a little bit about the week plus since the president has had the virus. And we've seen two things that I think are particularly important. One of them is that the president got the most aggressive, experimental, state-of-the-art care. In fact, it's probably the case that he might be the only human being on the planet Earth who got the exact therapeutic treatment he got, including the Regeneron blood plasma infusion, right? Not even approved as an experimental treatment right now. The treatment the president got, minimally, it would cost $100,000. And one of the things we've seen about this viral outbreak, when we look at the racial demographics on it, with African Americans about 3 times as likely as white Americans to die, when we look at the economics along which the virus is spreading, with poor people unable to work from home or to stay away from work, doing jobs like working in Amazon fulfillment centers or meat packing plants or grocery stores or banks, where they're most exposed to the virus and where we depend on them most, we've seen that this is a virus that is not an equal opportunity disease. It attacks the less privileged. It has mainly spared the more privileged. The more privileged are able to get tests, effective treatment, right? And so the idea that the president came out of this saying, I went to school, I learned the virus is not all that bad, we will conquer it, don't be scared, I think indicates yet again that he is deaf to the actual human dimension of this virus. Yes, if you're president of the United States, yes, if you can spend $100,000 in 3 days on treatment, the virus may not be so bad. But while he is a 1 in 7 billion case in terms of the kind of treatment he got, Much more typical are the people who never got a test, who never were hospitalized, who've had to battle this virus on their own, so-called long haulers for whom 3, 4, 5, 6 months after they contracted the virus, they're still dealing with symptoms and trauma. And so for the President of the United States to say, I conquered this, don't be scared, I think really says to the people of the United States, he still doesn't understand what this virus is like for the average American. One more thing I want to add. You may have seen he stood on the White House lawn yesterday, or maybe in front of a blue screen, we don't exactly know, and touted Regeneron's plasma treatment and says that he feels younger and better as a result of getting it and that he wants to make it available to everyone. Please note, there's not even experimental approval for this drug. That means there have been no clinical trials of this drug. It's only used for emergency humanitarian purposes, right? The president got that kind of exception to be able to use the drug. So he's telling us he wants everyone in the country for free to be able to use a treatment that there haven't even been clinical tests of yet. I am reluctant to say this, but that moment more than any other made me think that the President of the United States appears more and more like a snake oil salesman when it comes to this virus, that he has squandered the tremendous authority and credibility that comes with the office of the President of the United States, that he is so dissociated from reality, so unwilling to listen to expertise, that at this point we listen to him at our own mortal danger. And that's the last element of the collapse of the credibility of Donald Trump, the myth of Donald Trump. He has relied on bravado. He has relied on machismo. He has suggested again and again, including in the debate against Joe Biden, that wearing a mask is wimpy, right? Taking a life-saving precaution isn't sufficiently macho, so he's not going to do it. And I do think at this point, we need to ask, has not only the myth of Donald Trump collapsed, but have we perhaps learned something from it about, on the one hand, the total lack of commitment to core democratic norms on the part of the political party that he's in charge of, right? The fact that the senators did not find what he did in the Ukraine to be problematic, but even more importantly, that they've been unwilling to say, we need to support science and medicine and public health in order to get this virus under control, in order to then be able to resume normal life, whether that's seeing our family members, hugging each other, sending our children to school, or returning to work in person. We cannot have an economic recovery. We cannot have a resumption of normality until we master the virus. And the President of the United States is unwilling to take the steps necessary to master the virus, and his entire political party has supported him as he has engaged in magical thinking about the virus. I think that we may not only see the Democratic Party win a substantial victory in November, but that we may see the Republican Party suffer lasting damage from its close association with this president, and that this may in fact be an opportunity for American democracy to begin to repair itself, because we are clearly in dire straits at the moment. I will stop there. Of course, I will take your questions and comments. Let me unmute everyone. Who wants to start us out? You may need to unmute yourself by pushing the space bar.
From your words to God's ears. That's all I could say.
Right.
Because I don't know that so much damage has been done that Joe Biden and God himself could not repair everything. It's a
yeah. Well, I think it's rarely the case that a politician, even the president of the United States, by himself repairs the institutions of the Constitution and democracy in the United States. This will be a topic for another lecture, but it's the people of the United States who do it. And for that to happen, and I'll just say a minute's worth on this. On the one hand, the people of the United States, and particularly the people who supported Donald Trump, need to learn the lesson of this episode in American politics. But the Democrats also need to learn the lesson. And so I think one of the reasons that Joe Biden is doing so well is, of course, because he's not Donald Trump, right? And in a sense, he's the polar opposite, and so many people are hungry for that. But I think it's also because this is, you know, a white elderly man from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who went to the University of Delaware. And there's some sense that maybe he would govern with the interest not only of the liberal Democratic majority, which is primarily concentrated in the coastal cities of the United States, but also with some attention to the people of the industrial Midwest and the rural portions of our country who feel completely neglected by the Democratic Party. And so if Biden really wants to repair American democracy, he needs to find ways of saying to those voters who feel completely neglected, not only by the Democrats, but by politics as usual, that we can actually do things to help you. And that you don't need to see those coastal liberals in a zero-sum perspective. Either they get it or you get it. That there are things that can be done that are good for everyone in the United States. And frankly, I'm sorry to say, they're much more likely to be done by the Democratic Party if they can control the institutions of national government right now than they are by the Republican Party.
I commend you for today's lecture.
Thank you, Mary. Do you have a question or anything else? I hope.
I'm just mesmerized by the whole, because you spoke so truthfully how I would think the majority of us feel.
Well, and if there's someone who doesn't agree, I would love to hear, because I think in a sense, when we're talking to people we already agree with, it's easy,
I know,
right?
I know,
and we need to be talking with people who don't agree with us.
Yes.
And so by all means, if there's anybody who wants to push back, please give me your response and let's have a conversation.
I don't want to push. I don't want to push back, but I want to say two things. Regeneron, or whatever that is,
Yeah.
name it, is not getting enough attention for all the things that you discussed about it. People believe maybe that's going to be wonderful, even if it costs a lot of money. Maybe it's something great. So I don't know that lesson of that it wasn't even registered for this use. And the second part of that is today's New York Times has an article, big article on it, and talks about how it's using fetal tissues from fetuses, and that's against the law. And I haven't really heard, and it's against Donald Trump's law. I haven't really heard any discussion of that, like it's not that important right now. And I really think it is important for a lot of people, especially the group supporting the new Supreme Court nominee who belongs to this cult, and it is a cult, and that disturbs me there.
It's not a cult.
Yeah.
It is a cult. So I think it's a cult.
No, it's not.
Well, I really,
So let's put to one side the religious affiliation of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, right? And maybe we'll learn more about it, and as the hearings proceed, if they do proceed,
Right.
we'll get more information and be better able to form informed opinion about her religious affiliation. What I would say about the Regeneron, right, it's a blood plasma therapy, that look, this may be a promising medical development. And I happen to think, look, we are in a new age of medical research, and there are a lot of promising therapies out there that 10 years from now, 5 years from now, may be doing things that are going to really work to limit human misery. So we should be excited about that prospect. But having said that, to point to that therapy, which is untested, not really understood, as a miracle cure because the president feels better after having taken it. By the way, he's also on steroids, etc. We don't really know why the president's feeling so much better, right?
Right.
But this is indicative of a pattern of thinking that has been there more or less from the present with from the beginning with Donald Trump and the pandemic, and that is a kind of silver bullet approach to the pandemic. We're going to do one thing and it's going to go away, right? We're going to close travel to China. We're going to find an anti-malarial disease and it's going to make it such that people are essentially cured by it. We're going to get a vaccine in record time. And this impatience with taking intermediary steps, right? So right now, we don't have a pharmacological cure for this disease or protection against this disease. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have successful therapeutics. We're doing a lot better. We've learned a lot more. By the way, part of the reason that the president's experience with the coronavirus was so much better than so many other Americans is because it happened to him in October as opposed to in March or April, right? And so to just return to the central point, we shouldn't be looking for one thing, right? Unfortunately, there is a new virus stalking the human race. And even after there's a vaccine, right? Thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people die from the flu each year, right? 100 years after it first entered the human ecosystem. This virus is going to be with us for a long time. We can all hope that we will get much better at coping with it, but a sober, mature approach involves recognizing that it will be life-altering, that we will probably have to spend another year fundamentally altering our behavior, but even after that, we will still be coping with the coronavirus and the deadly disease that it gives rise to. And so we need to get out of magical thinking. One magic silver bullet drug or therapy is going to get us completely out of this and we'll be right back to normal, better than ever. Unfortunately, leadership involves saying hard truths to the people in ways that make them understand it and accept it. And again, when I speak of the collapse of the myth of Donald Trump, what this week again has exposed is that he lacks the disposition, capacity, personality to lead a country during this kind of an emergency. All right, everyone.
One last question.
Oh, sure. Yes, please go ahead. I didn't realize.
Okay. I just have numbers on. My name is June, and I've been thinking about this. Been thinking about this nomination for the Supreme Court and what it stands for, because she stands for. She's against abortion. She's against the Affordable Care Act. She's against vote versus rate. That's on record. That's nothing to do with her education or background, but that is definitely on record. And I'm wondering if you think the Republicans, in order to save their positions, will turn on Trump and turn down this nomination.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that the pandemic, I'm sorry, let me revise that. The outbreak of the coronavirus in the White House and in the Senate, right? And it's ravaging the White House staff right now. And it's probably better contained in the Senate, but a couple members of the Judiciary Committee who happen to be Republicans also have the virus will certainly slow this down. And if the result is that there's a decisive electoral loss before Judge Barrett can be confirmed, we will have to see. And in a sense, this will maybe expose the Republicans' true colors. Let me give you a phrase that we'll talk more about in a subsequent lecture. June, this is a case of minoritarian rule, right? The Republicans control the majority of the Senate by getting a minority's votes. And it's about 20% of the population that translates into 60 senators, right? 60% of the votes in the senators. Donald Trump won the presidency without winning the popular vote. The Republicans controlled the House of Representatives for much of the last decade with almost never getting a majority of the popular vote, right? And the way in which gerrymandering, the Senate, the distribution of population, the Electoral College works has made the Republican Party viable despite the fact that it does not reliably get a majority of votes in most national elections in the United States. Does the Republican Party want to continue to play the game of getting only a minority of the votes, but using that power to control the key institutions of federal government? That's what the nomination of Judge Barrett is really about. It's about basically recognizing we may not control the presidency, we may not control the Senate. This is our last best opportunity to control one other branch of federal government, the judiciary. If they're not able to get her confirmed before the election, if they decisively lose the election, it will be so nakedly obvious what a power play this is that it will be more difficult for them to do it. Now, will that stop them? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, because it hasn't stopped them for the last decade. So how badly damaged is the Republican Party? Does it finally say to itself, let's not keep doing the damage. Let's not double down on Donald Trump's nominee for the court. And I think in a sense, the Democrats need to say two things. This is really just about Donald Trump nominating somebody for the Supreme Court. And the second thing is, this is about democracy. This should be the people's court. And if you appoint this justice, you are turning this Supreme Court, this hallowed institution, into another instrument of partisan minoritarian rule, and that's bad for the country. All right, everyone. Thank you for the good question, June. And I will give you a lecture on this topic that's more
Okay, great.
extensive at some
Thank
points.
you.
You
Thank
bet. Okay, take care, everyone. Great talking with you today. Please continue to be safe. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
You as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.